Welcome back. I am Pemberton, and this is part 3 of Herodotus' Histories. Croesus has his oracle, his allies, and his certainty, 3 things that have ruined more kings than any army. In this part he marches across the Halys against Cyrus of Persia, fights him to a bloody draw, makes the one decision a clever man should never make, and loses everything in a fortnight: his capital, his crown, and very nearly his life on a burning pyre. It is one of the great reversals in all of literature, and Herodotus tells it superbly. Let us go on.
So that is what happened concerning the mixing bowl. Meanwhile Croesus, misunderstanding the meaning of the oracle, was marching into Cappadocia, expecting to overthrow Cyrus and the power of the Persians. While Croesus was preparing to march against the Persians, one of the Lydians, a man who even before this time was thought wise, and who because of this advice gained a very great name for wisdom among the Lydians, advised him as follows. The man's name was Sardis. "O king, you are preparing to march against men who wear leather trousers, and the rest of their clothing is leather also. They eat not the food they desire, but whatever they can get, living as they do in a rugged land. Moreover, they make no use of wine, but drink water. They have no figs for dessert, nor any other good thing. On the one hand, if you defeat them, what will you take from them, since they have nothing? On the other hand, if you are defeated, consider how many good things you will lose. Once they have tasted our good things, they will cling to them tightly, and it will not be possible to drive them away. For my own part, I am grateful to the gods that they do not put it into the minds of the Persians to march against the Lydians." Thus Sardis spoke, but he did not persuade Croesus. It is true indeed that before the Persians subdued the Lydians, they had no luxury and no good thing. Now the Cappadocians are called Syrians by the Hellenes. Before the Persians ruled, these Syrians were subjects of the Medes, but at this time they were subjects of Cyrus. The boundary between the Median Empire and the Lydian was the river Halys. This river flows from the mountain land of Armenia through the Cilicians. Afterward, as it flows, it has the Macedonians on the right hand, and the Phrygians on the other side. Passing by these and flowing northward, it bounds on one side the Cappadocian Syrians, and on the left hand the Paphlagonians. Thus the river Halys cuts off almost all the lower parts of Asia from the rest by a line extending from the sea opposite Cyprus to the Euxine. This tract is the neck of the whole peninsula, and the journey across it takes 5 days for a man traveling without baggage. Croesus was marching into Cappadocia for the following reasons. First, because he wished to acquire the land in addition to his own possessions, and then especially because he trusted the oracle and wished to take vengeance on Cyrus for Astyages. Cyrus, son of Cambyses, had conquered Astyages and was keeping him prisoner. Astyages, king of the Medes, was Croesus' brother by marriage, and he had become Croesus' brother by marriage in this way. A band of nomad Scythians, at feud with the rest of their people, withdrew and sought refuge in the land of the Medes. At that time the ruler of the Medes was Cyaxares, son of Phreortes, son of Diox. At first he treated these Scythians well, since they were suppliants for his protection. Esteeming them highly, he entrusted boys to them to learn their language and the art of shooting with the bow. Time went by, and the Scythians used to go out continually to hunt and always brought something back. But once it happened that they caught nothing, and when they returned empty-handed, Cyaxares, showing on this occasion that he was not of a notably good disposition, treated them very harshly and insulted them. After receiving this treatment from Cyaxares, they considered that they had suffered indignity and planned to kill and cut up one of the boys who were being instructed among them. They would prepare his flesh as they usually prepared wild animals, bring it to Cyaxares, and give it to him pretending that it was game taken in hunting. After giving it to him, their plan was to make their way as quickly as possible to Halys, son of Sardis at Sardis. This was done. Cyaxares and the guests who ate at his table tasted that meat, and after doing this the Scythians became suppliants for the protection of Halys. After this, since Halys would not give up the Scythians when Cyaxares demanded them, war arose between the Lydians and the Medes and lasted 5 years. During these years the Medes often defeated the Lydians, and the Lydians often defeated the Medes. Among other battles, they also fought a battle by night. Since they still carried on the war with evenly balanced fortune, in the 6th year a battle took place in which, after the fighting had begun, the day suddenly became night. Thales the Milesian had foretold this change of day to the Ionians, setting as its limit this very year in which the change occurred. When the Lydians and the Medes saw that it had become night instead of day, they stopped fighting and both became much more eager to make peace with one another. Those who brought about the peace between them were Dionysus, the Cilician, and Labynetus the Babylonian. These men also urged them to take the oath, and they brought about an exchange of marriages, for they decided that Halys should give his daughter Arenice to Astyages, son of Cyaxares, since without the compulsion of a strong bond agreements are not likely to hold firmly together. These nations observe the same ceremonies in taking oaths as the Hellenes, and in addition they cut the skin of their arms, and then each licks up the other's blood. This Astyages, who was his mother's father, Cyrus had conquered and made prisoner for a reason that I shall declare in the history that comes afterward. This then was Croesus' complaint against Cyrus when he sent to the oracles to ask whether he should march against the Persians. When a deceitful answer came back to him, he marched into the dominion of the Persians, supposing that the answer was favorable to himself. When Croesus came to the river Halys, according to my account, he passed his army across by the bridges that were there. But according to the account current among the Hellenes, Thales the Milesian enabled him to pass his army across. They say that Croesus was at a loss as to how his army should cross the river, since, they add, the bridges that are there now did not yet exist at that time. Thales, who was present in the army, caused the river, which then flowed on the left hand of the army, to flow partly also on the right. He did it in this way. Beginning above the camp, he dug a deep channel and directed it in the shape of a crescent moon, so that the river, turned aside from its ancient course into this channel, would pass behind the camp where it was pitched, and afterward, passing by the camp, would fall again into its old course. As soon as the river was thus divided in two, both branches became fordable. Some even say that the ancient course of the river was dried up altogether. But I do not accept this tale as true, for how then did they cross the river when they went back? After Croesus had crossed over with his army, he came to the place in Cappadocia called Pteria. Pteria is the strongest place in this country, situated somewhere about in a line with the city of Sinope on the Euxine. There Croesus encamped and ravaged the fields of the Syrians. He took the city of the Tyrians and sold the people into slavery, and he also took all the towns lying around it. The Syrians, though they had done him no wrong, he forced to leave their homes. Meanwhile Cyrus gathered his own forces, and in addition took up all who lived in the region between, and came to meet Croesus. Before he began to lead out his army, he had sent heralds to the Ionians and tried to induce them to revolt from Croesus, but the Ionians would not do as he said. Then, when Cyrus had come and encamped opposite Croesus, the two armies tried one another by force of arms in the land of Pteria. After hard fighting, when many had fallen on both sides, night came on, and at last they parted from one another with no victory on either side. Thus the two armies contended with one another. Croesus was dissatisfied with his own army in respect to its numbers, for the army he had when he fought was much smaller than that of Cyrus. Being dissatisfied on this account, and since Cyrus did not attempt to advance against him on the following day, Croesus marched back to Sardis. He intended to call the Egyptians to his help according to the oath they had taken, for he had made an alliance with Amasis, king of Egypt, before making the alliance with the Lacedaemonians. He also intended to summon the Babylonians, with whom he too had concluded an alliance, Labynetus being at that time ruler of the Babylonians. Moreover, he intended to send a message to the Lacedaemonians bidding them appear at a fixed time. Then, after gathering all these allies and collecting his own army, his plan was to let the winter pass, and at the coming of spring march against the Persians. With these thoughts in mind, as soon as he came to Sardis, he sent heralds to his several allies to notify them that in the 5th month from that time they should assemble at Sardis. But the army he had with him, the army that had fought with the Persians and consisted of mercenary troops, he released and completely disbanded. He never expected that Cyrus, after contending against him with such even fortune, would after all march upon Sardis. While Croesus had these plans in mind, the suburb of the city suddenly became full of serpents. When they appeared, the horses stopped feeding in their pastures, came there continually, and devoured them. When Croesus saw this, he considered it important, as indeed it was. He immediately sent messengers to the dwelling of the Telmicians, who interpret omens. The messengers sent to consult them arrived there and learned from the Telmicians what the portent meant, but they did not succeed in reporting the answer to Croesus, for before they sailed back to Sardis Croesus had been taken prisoner. The Telmicians gave this interpretation: Croesus should expect an army speaking a foreign tongue to invade his land, and when it came it would subdue the native inhabitants, for they said the serpent was born of the soil, while the horse was an enemy and a stranger. The men of Telmessos thus answered Croesus after he had already been taken prisoner, not yet knowing anything of what had happened to Sardis or to Croesus himself. Cyrus, however, as soon as Croesus marched away after the battle fought in Pteria, learned that Croesus meant to disband his army after he had withdrawn. He took counsel with himself and concluded that it would be good to march as quickly as possible to Sardis before the power of the Lydians could be gathered together again. Having resolved on this, he did it without delay. He marched his army into Lydia with such speed that he himself was the first to announce his coming to Croesus. Then Croesus, although he was in a great strait, since his affairs had turned out altogether contrary to his expectation, nevertheless led the Lydians out to battle. At that time there was no nation in Asia more courageous or stronger in battle than the Lydian. They fought on horseback, carrying long spears, and the men were excellent in horsemanship. When the armies met in the plain before the city of Sardis, a wide and open plain through which rivers flow, especially the river Halys, all rushing down to join the largest river, called Hermos, which flows from the mountain sacred to the mother surnamed of Dindymos and runs out into the sea by the city of Phocaea, Cyrus saw the Lydians being drawn up for battle and feared their horsemen. On the suggestion of Harpagos and me, he did the following. He gathered together all the camels that were in the train of his army carrying provisions and baggage, took off their burdens, and set men on them equipped like cavalry. After he had furnished them in this way, he ordered them to go in front of the rest of the army toward the horsemen of Croesus. Behind the camel troop he ordered the infantry to follow, and behind the infantry he placed his whole force of cavalry. When all his men had been placed in their several positions, he charged them to spare none of the other Lydians, but to kill all who came in their way. Croesus himself, however, they were not to kill, not even if he resisted when captured. This was his command. He set the camels opposite the horsemen because the horse fears the camel and cannot endure either the sight of its form or the scent of its smell. For this reason the trick had been devised, so that the cavalry of Croesus would be useless, the very force with which the Lydian king most expected to distinguish himself. As the armies came together for battle, the horses, as soon as they scented and saw the camels, turned back, and Croesus' hopes were at once brought to nothing. Yet the Lydians did not act as cowards because of this. When they perceived what was happening, they leapt down from their horses and fought the Persians on foot. At length, after many had fallen on both sides, the Lydians turned to flight. Driven inside the wall of their fortress, they were besieged by the Persians. So the Persians established a siege. Croesus, supposing that the siege would last a long time, began sending other messengers from the fortress to his allies. The earlier messengers had been sent around to tell them to assemble at Sardis by the 5th month. These he now sent out asking them to come to his assistance as quickly as possible, because Croesus was under siege. And sending to his other allies, he also sent to Lacedaemon. But the Spartans too had at that very time, as it happened, a quarrel of their own with the Argives about the district called Pteria. This Pteria, which was part of the Argive possessions, the Lacedaemonians had cut off and taken for themselves. At that time the whole region toward the west, extending down as far as Malea, was possessed by the Argives, both the parts situated on the mainland and the island of Cythera with the other islands. When the Argives came to rescue their territory from being cut off from them, the two sides came to a parley and agreed that 300 men from each side should fight, and whichever side had the better in the fight should possess the disputed land. They also agreed that the main body of each army should withdraw to its own country and not stand by while the contest was fought, for fear that, if the armies were present, one side, seeing their countrymen suffering defeat, might come up to support them. After making this agreement, the armies withdrew, and chosen men from both sides were left behind and fought one another. They fought and proved equally matched. At last, out of 600 men, 3 were left, on the Argive side Alcinor and Chromios, and on the Lacedaemonian side Othryades. These were alive when night came on. The two Argives, supposing themselves the victors, set off running to Argos. But the Lacedaemonian Othryades stripped the corpses of the Argives, carried their arms to his own camp, and remained in his place. On the next day both sides came to inquire about the result, and for some time both claimed the victory for themselves. One side said that more of their men had remained alive. The other declared that those men had fled, while their own man had stood his ground and stripped the corpses of the enemy. At last, because of this dispute, they fell upon one another and began to fight. After many had fallen on both sides, the Lacedaemonians were victorious. The Argives then cut their hair short, whereas before they had been compelled by law to wear it long, and they made a law with a curse attached to it. From that time onward no Argive man should grow his hair long, nor should their women wear ornaments of gold, until they had won back Pteria. The Lacedaemonians laid down the opposite law for themselves, namely that they should wear long hair from that time forward, whereas before that time they had not worn their hair long. They say that Othryades, the one man left alive out of the 300, was ashamed to return to Sparta when all his comrades had been slain, and killed himself there in Pteria. Such was the condition of affairs at Sparta when the herald from Sardis arrived asking the Spartans to come to the assistance of Croesus, who was being besieged. Despite their own difficulties, as soon as they heard the news from the herald, they were eager to go to his help. But when they had completed their preparations and their ships were ready, another message came, reporting that the fortress of the Lydians had been taken and that Croesus had been made prisoner. Then, and not before, they stopped their efforts, grieving over the event as a great calamity. The taking of Sardis came about as follows. When the 14th day had come after Croesus began to be besieged, Cyrus sent horsemen around to the several parts of his army and proclaimed that he would give gifts to the man who first scaled the wall. After this the army made an attempt, and when it failed and all the rest had ceased from the attack, a certain Mardian named Herodotus tried to approach on that side of the citadel where no guard had been set. They had no fear that it would ever be taken from that side, because there the citadel was steep and unassailable. This was the only part of the wall around which Meles, who had once been king of Sardis, did not carry the lion that his concubine bore to him. The Talmicians had declared that if the lion were carried around the wall, Sardis would be safe from capture. Meles carried it around the rest of the wall, that is, those parts of the citadel where the fortress was open to attack, but he passed over this part as unassailable and steep. This is the part of the city that faces Tmolos. On the day before the capture, the Mardian Heroides had seen one of the Lydians descend on that side of the citadel to recover his helmet, which had rolled down from above, and pick it up. He thought about this and turned the matter over in his mind. Then he himself climbed up first, and after him came others of the Persians. When many had thus made their approach, Sardis was finally taken, and the whole city was given up to plunder. Meanwhile, this is what happened to Croesus himself. He had a son, whom I mentioned before, who was good enough in disposition, but deprived of speech. In his former prosperity Croesus had done everything possible for him, and among other plans he had devised, he had sent messengers to Delphi to inquire about him. The Pythian prophetess spoke to him thus: "Lydian master of many, Croesus, greatly blind to destiny, do not desire to hear in your halls that much prayed for voice, the voice of your son. It would be far better for you if this were kept away, for he shall first utter speech on an evil day of misfortune." When the fortress was being taken, one of the Persians was about to kill Croesus, taking him for another man. Croesus, seeing him coming on, cared nothing because of the misfortune that had come upon him, and it made no difference to him if he should be killed by the stroke. But his voiceless son, when he saw the Persian coming on, burst the bonds of his speech through terror and distress, and said, "Man, do not kill Croesus." This son first uttered his voice then, and after that he continued to speak for the whole rest of his life. The Persians had now taken possession of Sardis, and had captured Croesus himself, after he had reigned 14 years, and had been besieged 14 days, fulfilling the oracle by bringing his own great empire to an end. After the Persians took him, they brought him before Cyrus. Cyrus piled up a great pyre and had Croesus climb onto it bound in fetters, together with twice 7 sons of Lydians. Perhaps he meant to dedicate this offering as first fruits of his victory to some god. Perhaps he wished to fulfill a vow, or perhaps, having heard that Croesus was a god-fearing man, he had him placed on the pyre because he wished to know whether any divine power would save him from being burned alive. They say he did this. But as Croesus stood on the pyre, even in such evil circumstances, the saying of Solon came to his mind, how Solon had said with divine inspiration that no one still living could be called happy. When this thought came into his mind, they say that after long silence he sighed deeply and groaned aloud, and 3 times uttered the name of Solon. Hearing this, Cyrus ordered the interpreters to ask Croesus who this person was on whom he was calling. They came near and asked him. For a time, it is said, Croesus kept silent when asked, but afterward, when pressed, he said, "One with whom I would have wished all monarchs to speak, more than I would wish for much wealth." Since his words were unclear, they asked again what he meant. As they pressed him urgently and gave him no peace, he told how Solon the Athenian had once come, had inspected all his wealth, and had made light of it with such and such words, and how everything had turned out for him just as Solon had said, not speaking especially with a view to Croesus himself, but with a view to the whole human race, and especially to those who think themselves happy. While Croesus related these things, the pyre had already been lit and its outer edges were burning. Then, they say, when Cyrus heard from the interpreters what Croesus had said, he changed his purpose. He considered that he too was only a man, and that he was delivering alive to the fire another man who had been no less fortunate than himself. He also feared repayment and reflected that nothing possessed by men is secure. Therefore, they say, he ordered them to extinguish the burning fire as quickly as possible and to bring Croesus and those with him down from the pyre. They tried hard, but they were no longer able to master the flames. Then the Lydians relate that Croesus, learning how Cyrus had changed his mind and seeing that everyone was trying to put out the fire but could no longer check it, cried aloud and entreated Apollo. If any gift he had ever given had been acceptable to the god, he prayed that Apollo would come to his aid and rescue him from the evil now upon him. So with tears he entreated the god, and suddenly, they say, after clear sky and calm weather, clouds gathered, a storm broke, rain fell in a very violent shower, and the pyre was extinguished. Then Cyrus, perceiving that Croesus was a lover of the gods and a good man, had him brought down from the pyre and asked him, "Croesus, tell me, who of all men persuaded you to march upon my land and become my enemy instead of my friend?" Croesus answered, "O king, I did this for your good fortune and my own misfortune, and the cause of it was the god of the Hellenes, who incited me to march with my army. No one is so senseless as to choose war instead of peace of his own will, for in peace sons bury their fathers, but in war fathers bury their sons. But I suppose it was pleasing to the divine powers that these things should happen in this way." So Croesus spoke, and Cyrus loosed his bonds, had him sit near him, and treated him with much regard. Cyrus himself and all those around him marveled at the sight of Croesus. Croesus, wrapped in thought, was silent. After a while he turned and saw the Persians plundering the city of the Lydians, and he spoke to Cyrus. "O king, must I tell you what happens to be in my mind, or must I keep silent in my present fortune? Say boldly whatever you desire. What business is this great multitude of men doing with so much eagerness? They are plundering your city and carrying away your wealth. It is neither my city that they are plundering nor my wealth that they are carrying away, for I no longer have any property in these things. It is your wealth that they are carrying and driving away." Cyrus was concerned by what Croesus had said. He ordered all the rest to withdraw and asked Croesus what advantage he saw for him in what was being done. Croesus answered that since the gods had given him to Cyrus as a slave, he thought it right, if he saw anything more clearly than others, to point it out to him. He said that the Persians were by nature unruly and were without wealth. If Cyrus allowed them to carry off great wealth and plunder, and take possession of it, he should expect that whoever gained the largest share would rise in rebellion against him. Therefore, if what Croesus said pleased him, he should set spearmen of his guard to watch at all the gates. These men should take away the goods and tell those carrying them out of the city that they must first be tithed for Zeus. In this way Cyrus would not be hated by them for taking the goods by force, while they, acknowledging within themselves that he was doing what was just, would willingly let the goods go. Hearing this, Cyrus was exceedingly pleased, because he thought Croesus advised well. He praised him greatly and ordered the spearmen of his guard to carry out what Croesus had advised. After that he spoke to Croesus. Croesus, since you are ready, like the king you are, to do good deeds and speak good words, ask me for a gift, whatever you desire to be given you at once. Master, you will please me most if you permit me to send these fetters to the god of the Hellenes, whom I honored most of all gods, and to ask him whether he considers it right to deceive those who do well to him. Cyrus asked what accusation Croesus made against the god, that he made this request. Croesus repeated to him all that had been in his mind, the answers of the oracles, especially the votive offerings, and how he had been incited by the prophecy to march against the Persians. Having said this, he returned again to his request that he be allowed to make this reproach against the god. Cyrus laughed and told him that he would obtain not only this from him, but whatever else he might desire from him at any time. Hearing this, Croesus sent certain Lydians to Delphi, instructing them to lay the fetters on the threshold of the temple and ask the god whether he felt no shame that by his prophecies he had incited Croesus to march against the Persians, persuading him that he would bring the empire of Cyrus to an end, when these fetters were the first fruits of spoil he had won from it. They were to display the fetters while asking this. They were also to ask whether the gods of the Hellenes thought it right to practice ingratitude. When the Lydians came and repeated what they had been ordered to say, it is related that the Pythian prophetess answered as follows: It is impossible even for a god to escape fated destiny. Croesus has paid the debt due for the sin of his fifth ancestor, who, being one of the spearmen of the Heraclidae, followed the treacherous device of a woman, killed his master, and took possession of his royal dignity, which did not belong to him by right. Although Loxias earnestly desired that the calamity of Sardis should fall upon the sons of Croesus, and not upon Croesus himself, it was not possible for him to draw the destinies aside from their course. But so much as they granted, he brought to pass and gave as a gift to Croesus. He delayed the taking of Sardis by 3 years. Let Croesus be assured that he was taken prisoner later by these years in the fated time. Secondly, Loxias assisted him when he was about to be burned. As for the oracle that was given, Croesus finds fault with it wrongly. Loxias told him beforehand that if he marched against the Persians, he would destroy a great empire. When he heard this, if he wished to take good counsel, he ought to have sent and asked further whether the god meant his own empire, or that of Cyrus. But since he did not understand what was uttered, and did not ask again, let him declare himself the cause of what followed. Also, when he consulted the oracle for the last time, Loxias said what he said concerning a mule, but this too Croesus failed to understand. Cyrus was in fact this mule, since he was born of parents of 2 different races, his mother of nobler descent, his father of less noble. She was a Median woman, daughter of Astyages and king of the Medes. He was a Persian, one of a race subject to the Medes, and though inferior in all respects, he was husband to one who was his royal mistress. Thus the Pythian prophetess replied to the Lydians. They brought the answer back to Sardis, and repeated it to Croesus. When he heard it, he acknowledged that the fault was his own and not the gods. This, then, is how matters happened concerning the empire of Croesus, and the first conquest of Ionia. There are many other votive offerings made by Croesus in Hellas, not only those already mentioned. First, at Thebes of the Boeotians there is a golden tripod, which he dedicated to Ismenian Apollo. At Ephesus there are the golden cows, and the greater number of the pillars of the temple. In the temple of Athene Pernia at Delphi there is a large golden shield. These were still remaining down to my own time, though others of his votive offerings have perished. The votive offerings of Croesus at Branchidae of the Milesians were, as I am told, equal in weight and similar to those at Delphi. The offerings he sent to Delphi, and to the temple of Amphiros he dedicated from his own goods and as first fruits of the wealth inherited from his father. But the other offerings were made from the substance of a man who was his enemy. Before Croesus became king, this man had taken part in faction against him and had joined in trying to make Pantalon ruler of the Lydians. Pantalon was a son of Alyattes and a brother of Croesus, though not by the same mother, for Croesus was born to Alyattes from a Carian woman, while Pantalon was born from an Ionian. When Croesus gained possession of the kingdom by the gift of his father, he put to death the man who opposed him, drawing him on the cart and comb. That man's property, which even before that time Croesus had vowed to dedicate, he then offered in the manner described to the shrines that have been named. Let this be enough about his votive offerings. The land of Lydia has no great store of marvels to record compared with other lands, except for the gold dust carried down from Tmolus. But it does have one work to show that is far larger than any other, except only those in Egypt and Babylon. This is the sepulchral monument of Alyattes, father of Croesus. Its base is made of large stones, and the rest of the monument is piled up earth. It was built by contributions from those who practiced trade, the artisans, and the girls who plied their traffic there. Still existing in my own time were 5 boundary stones set up on top of the monument, with inscriptions carved on them telling how much of the work was done by each class. On measurement, it was found that the work of the girls was the greatest in amount. For the daughters of the common people in Lydia all practice prostitution in order to gather dowries for themselves, continuing this until the time when they marry, and the girls give themselves away in marriage. The circuit of the monument is 6 furlongs and 200 feet, and its breadth is 1,300 feet. Adjoining the monument is a great lake, which the Lydians say has a never-failing supply of water. It is called the Lake of Gyges. Such is the nature of this monument. The Lydians have almost the same customs as the Hellenes, except that they prostitute their female children. They were the first men, so far as we know, who struck and used coin of gold and silver, and they were also the first retail traders. The Lydians themselves say that the games now in use among them and among the Hellenes were also their invention. They say these games were invented among them at the same time as they colonized Teessenia, and this is the account they give. In the reign of Hades, son of Manes, their king, a grievous famine came over the whole of Lydia. For a time the Lydians continued to endure it, but afterward, when it did not cease, they sought remedies. One man devised one thing, and another another. Then, they say, the ways of playing with dice, knucklebones, the ball, and all other games were discovered, except draughts, for the Lydians do not claim the discovery of that last one. They invented these games as a resource against the famine, and they used them in this way. On one day they would play games the whole time so that they might not feel the want of food. On the next day they stopped playing and ate. In this way they went on for 18 years. But when the evil did not slacken and pressed on them more and more, their king divided the whole Lydian people into 2 parts. He appointed by lot one part to remain and the other to leave the land. The king appointed himself over the part whose lot was to stay in the land, and his son over the part that was departing. His son's name was Teessinos. So the party whose lot it was to go forth from the land went down to the sea at Smyrna and built ships for themselves. In these they placed all the movable goods they had and sailed away to seek means of living and a land to dwell in, until, after passing by many nations, they came at last to the land of the Ambracans. There they founded cities and dwell up to the present time. Changing their name, they were called after the king's son who led them out from home, not Lydians, but Teessenians, taking the name from him. The Lydians then had been made subject to the Persians, as I have said. After this our history goes on to inquire about Cyrus, who he was that destroyed the empire of Croesus, and about the Persians, how they obtained the leadership of Asia. I shall write according to the report of some of the Persians, those who do not desire to glorify the story of Cyrus, but to speak what is in fact true. I could also set forth the other forms of the story in 3 different ways. The Assyrians ruled Upper Asia for 520 years, and the Medes were the first to revolt from them. The Medes, fighting for their freedom against the Assyrians, proved themselves good men. Thus they pushed off the yoke of slavery and were set free. After them the other nations also did the same as the Medes. When all on the continent were independent in this way, they returned again to despotic rule as follows.
And there we leave Lydia, its king pulled from the flames to become the wisest of Cyrus's advisers, its gold flowing east, its proud cavalry taught to play the lyre and keep shop so they would never fight again. Next time, in part 4, Herodotus turns the clock back to ask the obvious question, who are these Persians, and where did Cyrus come from? Mind the footnotes, and beware the folly.